Good evening, everyone. My name is Joan McAlpine. I'm the Business Development Manager of the Robert Burns Ellisland Trust, which is the membership charity which looks after Robert Burns Ellisland Farm, 6 miles outside Dumfries, which most of you will be familiar with. I'd like to welcome you all here tonight. It's events like this as part of our Spring into Burns season that have really put Ellisland on the map. In terms of one of the most dynamic sites in the life of Burns. And those of you who attended our conservation study event in January will know that it's now officially one of the most authentic sites and most authentic homes in the life of Burns. So tonight, our Spring into Burns lecture is the Poet as Economic Powerhouse, and it's delivered by Professor Murray Pittock, who's giving his time tonight, and we're really grateful for that. So I want to say a few words later about Murray, but first I'd like to thank you for supporting the Trust and give you a little bit of an update on what we have been doing. Our January event launching the conservation study had over 100 people attending. Unfortunately, because of family illness, our February event with Pauline Mackay, Dr. Pauline Mackay at Glasgow University, had to be postponed, but that'll be rescheduled for May. And we're looking forward to the Treasures of Ellisland event with our Deputy Chair, Dr. David Hopes, in April. And I'll give you more details of that later. These kind of events are free to members, and it's one of the reasons why we have been able to triple our membership at the Robert Burns Ellisland Trust, because this is part of the offer. So if you have friends and family that are interested in Burns and you think you would enjoy these kind of events, please let them know that for £15 a year they can have access to this kind of expertise. Since our last event, we've had more funding from the Architectural Heritage Fund, who have given us a grant to pursue a viability project in terms of taking forward the site and adapting the buildings as well as repairing them, because some of you who have followed us will know there's quite substantial repairs needed. So we're really grateful for that, and we have got quite substantial help from South of Scotland Enterprise, who visited us on Monday, and we can share more about that with you at a later date. This particular lecture is really close to my heart because in a previous guise in the Scottish Parliament, I led a couple of debates on Robert Burns and the Scottish economy, very much instigated by the approach from Murray Pittock. And I feel as a result of Murray Pittock's report that followed on from the first debate, we've actually already seen a lot of activity in Dumfries and Galloway designed to boost Robert Burns and the Scottish economy. Ellisland's led a project, an online project called The Footsteps of Burns, which brought together trails around Dumfries and Burns's life. I don't think that would have happened in the way it did without Murray's report. And Dumfries and Galloway Council have formed the Robert Burns tourism partnership and commissioned their own research. Again, I think that's directly related to the work that Murray has done, which is really quite astounding when you think that it's almost as soon as the report came out, we had a pandemic which affected the heritage industry significantly. So it just shows how important his research is. So a little bit of a word about Murray himself. He's the Pro Vice Principal of the University of Glasgow, which means, as well as his outstanding academic work, he leads a lot of management projects, and he was absolutely central to the university's role in the conversion of the Kelvin Hall. He is the Bradley Professor of Literature at the university. He's published so many books, I can't list them all here, but his Culloden was named Book of the Year in History Today, and he's currently working on the Global History of Scotland from Yale University Press. He was also instrumental in the university setting up the Centre for Robert Burns Studies in 2007 and has been driving it forward. They received a 1.1 million grant from the Arts and Humanities Research Council for editing Robert Burns in the 21st century. That's coming out in Oxford University Press. In fact, it's already coming out in Oxford University Press. And of course, our own trustee, Professor Jerry Crothers, is deeply involved in that. So the Centre and Glasgow University, who've been incredibly helpful to us, are actually part of that driving economic value from Robert Burns already. And Murray has been so much part of that. So he's a man of action as well as a man of words, and we're really looking forward to hearing what he has to say tonight. Over to you, Professor Pittock.
Thank you very much, Joan, from me, Murray, and welcome to everybody. Thank you very much for coming along, particularly at this time in the evening. I'm going to talk about food a lot, so I hope in the traditional Edinburgh greeting you'll have had your tea, because otherwise all this conversation about food might just make you a wee bit hungry. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the Burns report as it stood in 2020, and some directions, particularly coming out of the pandemic, and also the changing focus we have in different areas of policy, including the environment and sustainability, which have become much more focused even than they were two years ago, how these can actually feed into new ways forward based on the findings of that report. There's the debate, the debate led by Joan in the Scottish Parliament in 2020, and her launch of the report at the Robert Burns Birthplace Museum, National Trust for Scotland's Birthplace Museum, there on the left. So it gained quite a lot of attention when it first appeared. Some of the headlines, just to reinscribe those, that the overall value of Burns was calculated around 203 million. Of that, 154 million was derived directly or indirectly from tourism, 76% of the value of Burns as of 2020. Of that, Ayrshire and Arran accounted for 6 times as much as Dumfries and Galloway, and everywhere else counted for just 12 million of the 154 million pounds, about 8%. So there were actually some notes in the report as to how Burns tourism could become national, as well as how it might develop further in Dumfries and Galloway. Of the non-tourism elements, Burns festivals had an additional value of 7 million. Produce and retail, that was simply a turnover value, size value, were 20 million. The Burns supper had an impact of around about 11 million, but that's on the Scottish economy only. We're not talking about the international impact of the Burns supper, though there were a few examples of that quoted. Public and cultural value of Burns, I'll say a bit more about that, around about 10 million. And a measure of embedded brand value, that is, measuring the value of Burns to the Scottish brand, that is, and that required a little bit more mathematics than some of the others, but it's a mathematical model based on brand evaluation, originally carried out commercially for very different kinds of produce than Burns, but it's really about secondary motivations, why you think about visiting Scotland. What is it that draws you to Scotland, even though you might then go just to see Edinburgh Castle or to the festival and not have anything to do with Burns at all. Burns has part of the overall embedded brand value of the country. But interestingly, that you'll see in red there, I noted, we calculated was only increasing at about 0.77% a year, and the 203 million, the actual direct and indirect impact of Burns on the economy, was increasing by also at that time a barely inflationary rate. So that actually one of the concerns this otherwise powerful report wanted to express was that actually in real terms Burns wasn't gaining as a percentage of Scottish economic output. In real terms, it was moving forward very slowly, and there were ways in which that could be improved. And some of those ways were looked at in the recommendations of the report, which are there. I won't revisit them. It's easy to get hold of the report in PDF, and I can send one to anybody who can't find it online. So The methodology of the report was that economic impact was based on the fundamentally on tourism motivation data, moderated by the kind of visitors to the kind of places, and questionnaires and post-visit destination reporting and accounts of why people visited places, food, drink, and retail value and burn suppers by turnover. The embedded cultural value is some of the thing I'm going to speak about tonight. Now, that's quite often ignored in economic modeling, but there is quite a lot of economic modeling out there for cultural value. And what it fundamentally turns on is a range of issues which are linked to what people are prepared to pay, what they're prepared to spend if they live close to or are engaged with heritage attractions. So there are lots of reasons for people to actually want to live in South Ayrshire, for example, but the Barnes Birthplace Museum has a discernible effect on house prices. Now, that's a mixed blessing, but that's one of the reasons that there's so much new build close to it. And not only that, but it has an economic impact on the kinds of businesses that are within a certain radius, without going into too much detail, the modeling of the place. And the issue, I think, for Dumfries, which I suggested, and I'll come to that, is that Dumfries has got, in a sense, a unique resource for a major writer globally. That is, it's got 4 places in which the writer lived in the town, would-be city, but currently the town itself and its environs. Now, one of the things about embedded cultural value is that it can be used both to drive tourism and to drive local economic activity, both dependent on and independent of tourism. And the benchmark here is Mozart. Mozart was worth, in a detailed study carried out by the Austrian government, 5 billion euro to the Austrian economy 17 years ago, and is worth a significantly larger sum now. That is a very large sum. Austria's only got around 8.5 million people. It's not that much bigger than Scotland. It's a colossal amount of money. But one of the things they've done is they've created what I'm going to call, what in France would be called a terroir, a cultural terroir, as the infrastructure for Mozart, that they've embedded the story of Mozart not only in his birthplace, place of origin, Salzburg, but also very much in Vienna. They have linked the brand to the culture of the country at every possible point. And that is where that has an effect that I'll talk about later. So this is the main shopping street in Vienna, and it is the Mozart superstore. So you might blanch at the degree of commercialization here. There are considerably more now. There were 306 distinct Mozart product lines 20 years ago. Now there are many, many more than that. So the suite is the Mozart balls, which are almost ubiquitous, and of course are distributed and sell the Mozart brand at a low level throughout coffee shops and restaurants throughout Vienna and Salzburg, and indeed elsewhere in Austria, are supplemented by a huge range of, well, you can see the kind of thing, textiles, chocolates, postcards, souvenirs. So the idea of having a superstore dedicated to a single author is really quite alien to the Scottish tourism and heritage mindset. But actually, it's quite evident that this is extremely effective. It's not that Barnes isn't marketed and increasingly marketed, and I want to commend here the work that David Thompson has been carrying out in changing the kind of business model and the business focus of the Globe in getting it much higher profile, branding it as a Burnsian space in a much clearer way. And of course, we're all familiar with produce, which uses Burns's brand. But I want you to consider, such as the rabies super horseradish and Ayrshire meadows we have on this slide. But I want you also to consider how there is a lack, perhaps, of what you might think of as joined up marketing strategy about than the nature of that brand and the nature of the things that are the nature of the things that are sold. There are lots of places which have got some Burns tagged item or other, but there are very few places where you can get a range of Burns tagged items, or that there is even a distinct line in a corner on sale. Now, this is important because when it comes to culture, culture is one of the key things that sells to the visitors who create economic impact. And those are fundamentally people who stay overnight rather than day visitors from another close part of Scotland, the same Scottish region, for example. Now, there are various kinds of ways of looking at cultural value, and some of them are religious, spiritual, cathedrals. Some of them are aesthetic, and that includes poetry. Some of them are social, and remember that Burns is social as well as aesthetic. There's hardly any more sociable writer on the planet than Burns because of the Burns Supper. Historic, certainly that. Symbolic, certainly that. Very strongly linked, though again not in an organized way, to humanitarian values and Scottish values of equality and openness, and authentic. Well, again, Burns, a man's a man for all that. Burns is often seen as an authentic figure. He is unquestionably a major part of the cultural capital of Scotland, and he underpins the national brand values on all counts. That is, people pay more to be close to a Burns landmark, particularly in Ayrshire. It's not so clear in Dumfries and Galloway. He provides cultural capital. He provides a story for places to sell about themselves, and there's so many locations linked to Burns. And he provides psychic income. That is, the presence of a Burns visitor attraction offers something which supports people's positive feelings about the place they're in, as well as the positive feelings of others who visit that place and people who are drawn to that place. Now, today I'm going to focus on one element, and that is food and drink. Sustainable produce tourism is increasingly big business at a time when last week 160,000 has just been awarded by Interface, the agency to support the commercialization of research and the linkage of research of university research and industry in Scotland, to support 17 sustainable Scottish food and drink businesses. And a lot of those came from applications came from across the supply chain, focusing primarily on carbon reduction and innovative products derived from carbon capture, resource efficiency technology, and sustainable agricultural practices, all in line with the Scottish Government Recovery from COVID plan. The recipients included Annandale Distillery in part of its journey towards net zero. Drimnin, the distillery at Drimnin, is the first net zero distillery in Scotland. So there is actually an example, and the drive of distilleries to become net zero is an important part of their story, their provenance, and their visitor appeal as we go forward into future years, I'd argue. So one of the things that actually creates value for a region or a locality are supply chains which are kept short. And I think we've seen in recent years, and we'll be seeing perhaps for different reasons in future years, the impact and risk to long supply chains. Food, of course, is quite possibly can have a short supply chain. And those short supply chains are really important for the local economy, for developing the idea of the local economy, for developing the idea of culture and creative industries, and the link between produce and tourism. In Scotland, we have not been particularly good at noting the fact that food is culture. Whiskey is part of Scottish culture. Food, and not just haggis, is part of Scottish culture too. and the distinctive story, because story is so important a part of provenance, which is so where does your food come from, which is such an important part of supply chains. Telling historic stories about local businesses supplied through short local supply chains is a really important part of embedding food as culture, not just simply as local produce. And once you embed food as culture, you deepen the story that you're telling about your area and the attraction it has for people who come there. I cannot be the only person who has been in visitor attractions in Scotland and found overseas visitors trying to find something Scottish to buy or eat and not finding any. Indeed, I have to say that when we did the Burns and the Scottish Economy report, it turned out that in large parts of Ayrshire, there were actually no themed Burns suppers run by any of the hotels. So really, I mean, admittedly, the January is an awful month for tourism, but there are other things you can do with Burns suppers in their time. You can have them a little bit later. Indeed, I know corporate Burns suppers that go into March. Basically, there was a real disconnect, and the disconnect extended to produce and supply chains as well as to the cultural story of Burns. So, as I suggested, Burns influences the international perception of what constitutes the Scottish brand. And if you look at some of the work carried out by the annual GfK Roper now, I think simply Ipsos Roper Index of National Brands, you'll find that Scotland is very strongly linked with culture. And because it's strongly linked with culture, people who come to Scotland have a high motivation. They're not necessarily direct cultural tourists. They haven't got a huge visitor list of monuments they want to visit, but although many of them do, but they're attracted by their culture, by culture. This is important for a lot of reasons. For one of those is that culture and creative industries add gross value added, produce twice as much economic value on average as the UK average business. Once you've got a strong and thriving cultural sector, it's really very productive of jobs and additional value. And sometimes we overlook just how widespread this footprint is across the world. And sometimes we lose out because of that. Burns suppers overseas, and roughly 9.5 million people go to official Burns suppers every year, are often great places to do trading business on sell Scottish produce, but frequently that's overlooked. And sometimes, we have Auld Lang Syne played at the closing ceremony at the Beijing Winter Olympics at a time when the UK government promotes Scottish produce across China using the characters for England. So we have a disconnect in that the Scottish brand is to some extent sold by the UK government, but to a great extent it isn't. It's either neglected or often misrepresented. And we have to be aware that there isn't anybody reliably doing this for us in large parts of the world, particularly when it comes to food and drink. There are other aspects we need to be aware of too, which I'm not going to go into today, but are linked to eating sustainably and healthily, and also to the power of culture for health and well-being. The recent economic impact assessment of the impact of the National Trust for Scotland estimates that the trust has an impact on Scotland's health and well-being of a value of around about £110 million, with £148 million of gross value added in terms of what that saving allows people to do and how it allows them to participate in the economy. So we need to be aware that when we map cultural provision, we're also mapping other things, direct and indirect economic impacts, which change the way that all of us feel about where we are, and in a double win, the attractiveness of the places we are for other people to visit. Now, there's quite a bit of work out there looking at this kind of thing. I've mentioned Anhalt Road, but this is another report. This is the British Council's report, Gauging International Perception, Scotland and Soft Power. This was actually carried out rather differently, not as a national branding exercise, but to look at a number of prominent sub-state areas with high levels of visibility, tourism, overseas visitors. So one of the interesting things is, I'm not going to go into any detail in this study, it's just one example, is that Scotland finishes 8th for cuisine. We might not think that we are below Flanders and Quebec in the way that visitors think about Scotland. And indeed, we certainly shouldn't be. Overtaking, I think they're rather kind, of course, having spent some time there myself, but never mind. But reaching the top is very much where we are and aspire to. But if you think about it, there is actually now a huge gulf in Scotland between really experimental, dynamic, and hybrid fusion food and really good ethnic cuisine, ethnocultural cuisine, and some pretty tired stuff, which still does the rounds. So it really depends on the kind of experience you have where you place Scotland on the cuisine league table. But too much of our cuisine, if that's what we're calling it, is potentially still letting us down. Now, if we were to, these are visitor numbers, and they're obviously massively out of date. They're now pre-pandemic, and there've been no decent visitor numbers that you can rely on because they've all gone down enormously since the pandemic started. But so these are the last, the audited, I think, 2018 figures for single-figure tourism in Scotland, not cultural tourism, but tourism linked to a single individual. And you'll see that there are quite a lot of sites, but you also see that, and you know, the John Muir, the country park figure is slightly skewed because, of course, people go to the John Muir Country Park without any interest in John Muir. But you know, there isn't a way of breaking down the numbers for the birthplace and country park. In that, the Barnes Birthplace Museum effectively is the top Barnes, and indeed, arguably any individual visitor attraction. Some, I said 2018, some of these 2017 figures in the case of where there was extensive work being carried out, which affected the 2018 figures. So, for example, the Wallace Monument is at 139,000. These are all in thousands. But if you look down, these levels, and the Barnes numbers are underlined, there are some places with really pretty poor levels of visitor numbers. And in some cases, that's a call for a strategy. In some cases, it's a call for connectivity. So when these numbers were composed, and Ellisland's official numbers at that stage were 1,400, Ellisland didn't actually appear on the Dumfries-Barnes Trail. Look, I know Ellisland isn't in Dumfries, but if I'm from Florida, that's kind of not really big in my head. I think it's in Dumfries if I'm from Florida. So the fact it wasn't actually on the trail was itself a real marker of lack of connectivity. And a lot of these relatively less visited places suffer, I think, from that lack of connectivity in the way that they're marketed, just as I suggested to you that the produce did. Now, if we were to look much greater aggregate at visits to, again, 2018 audited figures, Scotland's culture and heritage sites, we got some 24 million visits to cultural and heritage sites, plus 1 million to distilleries. I'm not separating this out because I don't think they're cultural heritage. I think they are, but they are, you know, there's obviously slightly different, but they could increase, given the new visitor centre, the new Johnny Walker Visitor Experience Centre in Princes Street, Edinburgh, these could increase quite substantially. However, they're likely to increase substantially anyway. So it's 1 million, but it was 1 million then. Tourism was at that stage 5% of Scotland's gross domestic product. But interestingly, in Scotland, 42% of all inbound spend for people coming into Scotland had an arts and culture engagement, which we reached 45% in Ayrshire and 48% in Dumfries and Galway, though this largest single impact came from the 1.1 billion into the Scottish economy injected by the Edinburgh Festival Fringe. Now, if we were to compare to go back to some other figures. I've got Graceland, Elvis Presley's house in Graceland, which itself has an economic impact of $150 million on Memphis, Tennessee alone. So actually not far off Barnes from one place in one city in the US. If you look back to Austria, Salzburg, which is the size of Dundee, had 7 million visitors with 2.33 million non-Austrian overnight stay visitors. And the total impact value of Austrian tourism is around about 10 times Scotland's, despite the fact that the Austrian economy is only about 75% bigger. 68% of Viennese tourists are cultural tourists, and they create 10% of the city region's gross value added. One of the interesting things there is that the creation of a cultural brand based on Mozart throughout Austria appears to have a measurable impact on the proportion of tourists who have an arts and culture priority engagement, which is about half as large again across the whole of Viennese tourism as it is for, say, Scottish tourism. So that's quite an interesting and significant figure. And of course, in Salzburg, I think the figure will be higher still, because the vast bulk of their entire very large tourist business is driven by two things, the sound of music and Mozart. So in some ways, we're also, the Barnes season also sustains in a much more modest way Scottish business. So 41% of all Scottish producer haggis sales are actually during the Barnes season. The Barnes season is absolutely critical for the bottom lines of all major haggis producers. And at the same time, the ability of the Barnes brand to support export is very interestingly present, though it's not quite a one-off, but the Barnes brand is not hugely used for export, in that less than 10% of Arran Distillery Barnes malts and blends are actually sold in the home market. Most of them are for export, and that's because of the market recognition that Barnes brings in export. Now, Scotland has done enormously well in terms of food and tourism, though Brexit is a real problem in terms of produce. By 2018, the food and drink market was worth 15 billion by turnover, and 21% of all overseas exports from Scotland before Brexit were food and drink, which was a rise of 62% since 2009. Again and again, the evidence is that importance of narrative and the presence of local branding and supply is important on that. That's highly recommended by 60% of UK visitors to Scotland. So 3 in every 5 UK visitors to Scotland from out with Scotland are positive and commend the story linkage, provenance linkage in food and drink. There's a particular advantage in the areas for Scotland, especially when supported by provenance and story in whisky, craft gin, bakery, confectionery, dairy, seafood, meat, fruit and veg. But as well as supporting visitor experience and short supply chains and better value for the local economy, there's also the question, which I shall deal with for the end of the talk, of carbon footprint. Now, as I said, the Dumfries area is uniquely gifted. There is no other place in the world which has got 4 houses linked to a globally important artist. Ellison's qualities, of course, as a unique resource are being developed tremendously by the trust, who really got the bit between their teeth here. And I hope that the putative Drammen Bannock tour that they're planning will be a nice counterpart to the kind of culinary development we're seeing at the Globe and elsewhere. That's Isle Tar, of course, the place where Barnes stayed when he was waiting for Ellisland to be completed. And I have to say, if it's it was as damp then as it is now, mind you, that can happen with Ellisland too. Then I don't think he could have been particularly comfortable there, as opposed to here. So, if you've got chance, there are quite a lot of initiatives which are already supporting the kind of developments I'm talking about. For example, Food for Life, which is a UK initiative, has got a very strong Scottish branch, supporting local produce and high quality produce for use in school meals and elsewhere. They're very means of promotion that we really aren't adopting very well at present or very consistently. Christmas, Father's Day, Michelin restaurants, vegan Scottish cuisine, and no sense of what this was very clear in the report, no sense of really yet developing a patrimoine or a sense of a place of food. There are some good examples in regional taste organizations, but taste of place, foodways, history and historic recipes have got a significant amount of potential. And although they are not absent in Scotland, there is still much more that could be done. I have to say that we supplied from Glasgow the PhD student working on food history, Lindsay Middleton, who helped to develop the National Trust for Scotland resource at Gladstone's Land in Edinburgh, which now has gone much more for particular local produce and indeed historic recipes. I recommend the historic 17th century ice cream recipe. Should you be passing, I can't really stop having them, so I need to stay away from that end of the lawn market. Now, locality, when we think about how locality is so centrally important to French understanding of food, and they certainly do understand the way food is embedded in culture, and to the marketing of that. For example, that one of the marketing features of life in Paris, which is promoted, is that 94% of the inhabitants are within 5 minutes walk of a bakery, and that the proportion of restaurants per thousand is a data point, per inhabitants is a data point for comparing French cities. Paris is 10, Nice is roughly second with 7.8, Lyon has 6.6. Anyway, these kind of data points, the footprint of food, both in terms of locality and of the resource of eating out, is very much part of thinking about the place we come from as a food place. And remember, if people are touring, if they're going on circuits in the North Coast or in the Southwest, they will be staying for longer. And the longer they stay, the more they spend, and the more they'll spend, the more persuasive story there is for them to spend it. And that means, particularly in terms of food and drink, produce. I've got nothing against Tyrrell's crisps, but when I consider how Tyrrell's crisps have actually utilized Herefordshire provenance, and pictures of happy farmers on the front of their packets, and are sold all over Scotland at heritage sites as well, you realize that actually we are on the back foot here. And they've actually done a better job of selling their English local cuisine in Scotland than we have done in selling our own to ourselves. So it's because the Scottish government's measurement suggests that the impact of local food on supply chains provides 80% more impact on the local economy, 80% more positive impact. So if we spend locally and have short supply chains, we will benefit local produce and business. And there are just so there are some real champions of this. I just want to call out Ruth Watson there. She is giving evidence to the House of Commons of Keep Scotland the brand, who's very much focused not just on keeping Scotland the brand, but on the importance of locality of produce. Just as part of another organisation I've been involved in, I just fed back to the Scottish Parliament's Local Food for Everyone consultation, because this kind of thinking of short supply chains is very much part of the thinking of government. Now, there are risks about this. So crop damage, adverse weather, business collapse, shortage of labour, which particularly post-Brexit is an issue. But there's also a general lack of substantial research in Scottish food history, which would help build greater awareness of the local produce story among customers from the area and the overnight tourist. And there can, in addition, be uncounted carbon impacts in local production. Not all impacts are, of course, transport costs. But there are a lot of good things on which we can start to build, whether those are regional food groups, tourist ambassadors, or examples like Mosgiel Farm, which I'll come to in a little bit. Much of the success of providers in the face of the pandemic can be accounted for by the agility, capacity, and preparedness to switch delivery channels and to focus on product lines most strongly in demand via that channel. And that certainly helped some of those businesses to get a lot of school meal contracts with local authorities that they didn't have 2 or 3 years ago, and probably wouldn't have got had they not had the agility to respond to the pandemic as they did. I think we also need to be much more aware of the carbon equivalent benefits of local food in sustainability. If we're looking at Scottish shellfish, that thing which is now much harder to sell in Europe than it was before, roughly 500 grams of Scottish shellfish has a 4 kilo CO2 equivalent impact, as opposed to 25 kilos for frozen East Asian. So those king prawns or langoustines you're buying frozen from Vietnam or Thailand are actually causing 6 times as much damage to the planet than Scottish langoustine. And Scotland was certainly several years ago the world's #1 langoustine producer. The Scottish langoustine are having. So we all need to be more aware of that too. That as well is an important marketing strategy, which is in its absolute infancy in terms of appealing to people with a conscience about the planet. Of course, they're visitors, of course, they're tourists, of course, they're traveled, or we get all that. None of us are consistent here, but that actually being able to give people local produce and to say that I know you visited here, but this is a benefit which is going to affect our environment and the environment of all of us, because we've thought about this and this is how we're marketing it. That's very positive. And of course, there are a lot of we need big public procurement to follow in this pathway. Local authorities, schools are doing really well actually. Local authorities and health boards though need to engage more across the piece. Now, if you have a look at, and it has been a success story at the website of Mosgiel Organic, they have at the top of that website the number of pieces of single-use plastic saved by their milk production and distribution as an ongoing ticker, which is rising all the time. Earlier this evening, it was 8,831,569. Awareness of that can make a real difference. And of course, it's been recognized by a lot. It's reusable packaging. It's focused on food miles and local production and on carbon emissions, have got a lot of awards. But actually, this is an opportunity not just for Mosgiel, very well as they have done, but for a much wider range of local businesses and producers. So what do we need? We need to have an encouragement and nudge budgetary pressure on public procurement that goes beyond schools, but into other council facilities and via health boards to hospitals, where, as I think anyone who's been in hospital knows, the food hasn't really progressed for many, many years. Recognition of the produce narrative's importance to the food and drink industry, and indeed its embedded value in our culture. Increasing publicity education on the carbon cost and other environmental vulnerabilities and extended produce supply chains. A provenance scheme for low carbon impact Scottish meat, for example, could borrow aspects of the beef chain scheme in Wyoming, which is worth looking up. It's fundamentally a quality charter mark based on blockchain, and digitally, of course, therefore widely available and accessible for Wyoming sourced meat. The presentation of local food everywhere as a local experience, and all that means, what it meant historically, what it means now in terms of culture, historic dishes and menus. I have been to many, well, not that many, I don't want to sound as if I do nothing but eat, 16th century banquets and 17th century historic banquets across the world. I've never been to one in Scotland. They may exist, but really there's some tremendous historic recipes as well as contemporary provenance in Scotland. And one thing that's really exciting about this and about the value of produce to culture, produce to burns, and burns to culture, and all of it to our national brand, is that there are real opportunities for all of us to build a much larger place for sustainable and locally provenance food in Scotland's culture, and indeed in connection with Scotland's greatest poet. Thank you. Okay, that's me. Happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Murray. That was absolutely fascinating. And if you pardon the pun, has given everyone a lot of food for thought. And thank you for the mention of our putative Burns and Bannock, Dram and Bannock tour at Ellisland, which we're working with South Scotland Destination Alliance on to build a visitor experience, a bookable visitor experience for the international market. And interestingly, just as your presentation has alluded to, we're partnering with Annandale Distillery, our corporate partners, in supplying the dram, and we're working with a baker to create our own Bannock, a local baker, to create our own Bannock. So there's so much potential, as you have outlined. Murray is open to questions around that absolutely fascinating talk, and there's already been a few listed. The first one is about Taste of Scotland and whether Taste of Scotland is still in existence. Does anyone happen to know whether Taste of Scotland still exists, and if it doesn't, should there be some kind of Taste of Scotland initiative?
So I thought that it didn't still exist, but it's possible it does. However, I think that it's itself a brand that that is no longer stick my neck out here particularly credible, because it started out being used relatively selectively, and it became less and less selective, and it didn't become a marker. Some of these things, some of these other schemes are markers of real change in practice. But Taste of Scotland wasn't really a marker that you got the Taste of Scotland, certainly by the late 1990s. Yeah. But does anybody actually know if it's still technically alive?
Well, I think Ellis, while you were speaking, did actually look at that. And according to the Scottish Government website, it says it still is alive, but right. Perhaps who knew? That's it. So yeah, no, that's clearly there's more work to be done there. I think I'm going to be a bit proactive in my chairing of this question and answer session, because I know that both Matt Baker and Tony Fitzpatrick from the Stove are here, and I've made Tony Fitzpatrick, the chair of the Stove Network, has made a couple of comments in the chat. And Tony, if you're still here, I don't know whether you want to elaborate on those comments. We'll even allow you to turn your camera on and unmute you if you're there, Tony.
Indeed, I am, Joan. Yeah, I'm just trying to get my camera going. Hold on. Yeah, the camera on. I can't see myself. Probably a good thing. Yeah, it was just the early part of the presentation, the issue of packaging come up, and I've just found that really interesting, because we had I think a couple of real success stories with packaging early on. I'm going back probably about 15 years or longer, but I'll quote a couple of examples. One was Spring Fling, and the other was the Major Events strategy driven by Ian Barr. And I think Ian and Rebecca Coggins, who drove the Spring Fling exercise, are both here. And I saw them as really, really fascinating, because there we recognised there were a lot of, in relation to Spring Fling, loads of makers speckled all across the region. They were all doing their own thing and had their own marketing, but the power of that networking and bringing them together so that they could jointly market and, in a sense, kind of build a sector. And it was, for me, a really good example of kind of sector building, and Spring Fling, I think, was a real success story. It was underpinned, and here's a real bit of history, it was underpinned with about 8 years of European funding. Remember that. and it took that kind of length of investment rather than the local authority finding money for a year or 2 years to do a special marketing drive. No, this was long to medium term. It was a similar thing with the events strategy. Again, we convinced the council to support the development of events as an economic driver. We had a number of them were springing up, and I think it was given a bit of momentum by the Booktown example as well. But we packaged again over about a kind of 8-10 year period, and it's still going. Dumfries and Galloway's offer in terms of events and major events down to medium-sized events. So I think a couple of good examples where we kind of regionalised the offer and but invested medium to long term in that packaging effort. And I don't know, maybe Ellis Lynn could be the trigger for a Burns level packaging. But I've suggested in my comment that looking at the wider regional offer in terms of cultural product may be worth considering. So I'd just be interested in your thoughts on some of that, Murray.
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, I agree. I think one of the things, see, I don't know very much about Spring Fling, but it sounds exactly the kind of area I was talking about. So I think one of the things that doesn't happen with these events typically is that they actually form part of a longer term strategy, which is laterally extended to other areas. So I mean, they're often, you get really successful festivals, engagements, networks, and they just fall on stony ground because they come and go. But you know, I think one of the things, some ways people had this under control in the 19th century, because one of the things they did in the first days of Burns tourism, when Mochlin ware was most of what they sold, is if you went to a Burns site, you couldn't buy the Mochlin ware of that site. You could buy one of the next site, so that it kept you moving. And I know that's very lateral, long way from where you're talking about with Spring Fling, but that actually triggers, when you talk about Ellison, triggers to go somewhere else, again, is something that we aren't always as good at as we could be. And I'm not saying there isn't good practice, but when people visit or have an experience, we're not quite so good always at, wouldn't you like to do this? Or how about this? You know, it's like the Amazon choice bar, basically, except, you know, in living time, we're actually, you can set people up with a tour or a trail, but you can also trigger casual passers-by, as it were, who just visited one site about doing another, or visiting a particular shop in town where you can buy really good produce. I mean, it's about helping each other, because a lot of small businesses, they don't have the ability to break into big markets because of the scalability of the marketing budget. So there's got to be a lot of mutual help, and it's got to be consistent, I think.
Thanks very much. That's really interesting. We'll actually be doing that with our Dram and Bannock tour, when we'll be pushing the Annandale Distillery Man of Words dram, which we'll serve to people, and we'll be pushing people towards the distillery. We're joined here by our Vice Chair, Trustee David Hopes, who has made a comment. I don't know whether you want to ask your question directly, David, and David might have something to say about our collection of Mochlin ware as well, which is not for sale, I should say.
Yeah, thanks, Joan, and hi, Murray. That was a super talk, and lots of fresh thinking. It's always good to hear you, and lots of questions there. But I'm just wondering whether the fact that Burns was a farmer and was a nature lover sets him apart, and just in terms of, you were talking about short supply chains, carbon footprints, and all the rest of it. Whether there's a particular opportunity there for Burns that isn't there, for example, with Mozart or other historical figures, and how we might then begin to monetize and capitalize on that.
So the answer to that is yes, and I was kind of hoping that would be, you know, read in, because we got there. It's a farmer. You've got actually a working farm, and so you really do need to build we need to build a produce, an event, market around Burns, because he fits perfectly. I mean, those ideas of authenticity and sociability are key, which are part of cultural capital, are absolutely key to developing a provenance market. And that's, as a farmer, as well as being unsuccessful, he's also official and authentic. Look, everyone can identify with him.
Yeah, good point.
So, absolutely, I completely agree with David. I mean, it's a complicated strategy to build, but of course, Burns is not a metropolitan figure, and when it comes to short supply chains and local produce and local inns, indeed, he's completely there. That's it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Thanks very much. A number of people have mentioned that Ian Barr and Rebecca Coggins from the Fries and Galloway Council are here, and I think that Ian Barr, who's leading on the Burns Tourism Partnership that I mentioned, had raised a hand. Ian, would you like to say a few words?
Thank you for bringing me in, Joan. I really appreciate it. I've really enjoyed the lecture, and I don't know if Murray is aware. You've probably briefed them behind the scenes that Murray's report was influential in establishing the Burns Tourism Partnership, which has got a really active membership here in Nithsdale. And Murray, what the two kind of key actions are, as well as try to support Ellisland and all of its work, is to have a biennial every 2 years, a conference on Robert Burns's legacies in Dumfries and Galloway, to kind of build up that profile that Mozart and Salzburg have, and also to try and provide seed corn finance for the development of Burns products. So we're very much on message, if you like, with what you've talked about tonight, and realise that collaboration and cooperation, because as you probably are aware, Dumfries and Nithsdale and the wider region, our business base is micro businesses.
Yeah.
A lot of my work as the council's events officer is the facilitation and collaboration of networks, if you like. But that's what we're trying to do. And in some ways, and thank you to Tony, it's a microcosm of our event strategy, which really tries to put money into events that can profile Dumfries and Galloway and build visitor numbers and local skills and development. So we've been really just so enthused by your report and Joan and the trustees' work at Ellisland and David Thompson's work in Annandale Distillery. And there's also some fantastic developments going on at Dumfries Museum as well. So hopefully once we get the first conference up and running, we'll inform you about it, and you can watch our progress and get involved as much as you would like to.
That's great news, because I think one of the issues, and there's a baseline struggle here, which is another story, which is how much people in Scotland are. I mean, people are more aware of Burns than they were, but how much they're actually exposed to Burns and how much they know about Burns in terms of their schooling and growing up. And it's difficult. It's more difficult sometimes than it used to be, that area. So actually getting people's awareness is a key part of upselling the brand and linking those micro businesses together to support each other and the network of tourist sites. Absolutely, it sounds great, and I look forward to hearing further.
Thank you very much. I'll let other people come in, but we're so enthused by how Burns's life changed when he came to Dumfriesshire and Ellisland, and there's certainly a point of difference between his life before and after Dumfriesshire, and that's something that we want to draw out for cultural development, tourism development, and just our local cultural knowledge as well.
Yep, absolutely. That's That's right. I mean, it's interesting that one of the earliest Chinese visitors to the UK made a point of going to visit the mausoleum in 1875. So a senior imperial civil servant, and it was remarkable. I'm rather confused with what he was seeing, but he has this description of it. You may know it, and but you know, stories like that, the global Dumfries, really have got a real resonance and interest, and they don't take much to put out there.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. We have a question from Matt Baker, and I could probably have predicted this question. I'll just put a little bit of context on it, because Matt leads the Stove Network, which is one of our few organisations in Dumfries and Galloway which is regularly funded by Creative Scotland. So it's an artists network, and they have been at the cutting edge of contemporary art, but also linking art to regeneration in the town centre of Dumfries, and they're behind the regeneration of Dumfries High Street through the Mid-Steeple Quarter. And Matt is asking about the link with contemporary culture. It would be really fantastic if Matt was able to ask his question directly. Matt, would you like to come on screen, so to speak? Don't be shy.
Sure thing. Is that me there?
Yeah, that's you.
Hey, Joan. Good evening, Murray. Thank you for the chat. It was really fascinating. I guess I'm not worrying. I'm wondering, because I see this as an opportunity, given that we're putting together a cultural strategy at the moment and everyone's trying to work together. And there's a lot of support, I think, for the idea of this bringing together the heritage offer. But clearly there's a very strong contemporary cultural offer in D&G at the moment. We're quite well known for it. Tony was talking about Spring Fling as one of those key parts. I'm just wondering, in terms of the research that you've seen elsewhere, is there an example? Because I could imagine a kind of contemporary Burnsian brand that we could all use. We need to do some waymarking at the moment in Dumfries. Our visitor offer is terrible. But I don't want to see us alienating our young people that are coming up through the cultural and creative industries, who are sort of like, we want to be thinking about the modern stuff and thinking, like if you think about Vienna, would the contemporary cultural crew in Vienna see the sort of Mozart balls as an inhibitor to their creativity, or yeah? Do you get where I'm asking?
I do it where you're asking, and you and David have raised some of the really important questions about why Burns for all this, and I think that's absolutely right. Look, I said there's one thing about Austria which is quite important, and that is that although those, in a sense, Salzburg owns Mozart, Vienna has largely has borrowed Mozart, but there isn't the same degree. Sometimes in Scotland we have a degree of resentment if somebody else has got Burns. And I think the issue is that for it to really work, we need not to have North Ayrshire versus South Ayrshire, and not wanting any Burns in Edinburgh, that kind of thing. So I think first of all we've got to accept that that everyone can own Burns. That's the way it works in successful ways elsewhere, rather than creating energy saying we're the best. But although Burns is really ours, but I think in terms of the contemporary, I'm not aware of any issues with it. I mean, people laugh at Mozart balls because they really are, they're ridiculous. They're everywhere. But on the other hand, they imprint a significant part of what it is of the importance of Austria. Austria's cultural history on anybody who has a coffee in numberless restaurants, so that we don't actually have, it's something very simple, which is a simple brand trigger like that. Burns his face on a lump of sugar, whatever. So that's one thing to consider. But the other thing is that actually Mozart is the best example, but he's also very clearly a contemporary figure because of the nature of performance. And Burns is a contemporary figure because of performance in a different way, not because people still say Burns' poems, but they do, and of course sing his songs, but they do. but also because Burns is, the Burns supper itself is culturally multiple and differentiated all over the world. So whether it's Gong Haggis Fat Choi in Vancouver, which is now extended outside Vancouver, the Chinese New Year Burns joint supper, or the joint Pressure and Burns Burns suppers in Slovenia, or the multiple images of Burns, which you doubtless see, Burns as Che Guevara, Burns as reggae artist, Burns as pop icon. All of these show that actually he's absolutely contemporary. I mean, not every Burns club would be happy with those images, but it's not difficult to have a contemporary iconography for Burns. It's already there because people are performing Burns in their millions every single year.
Great, thank you very much. I think it's entirely possible. I hope that we can keep it joined up in terms of when the heritage folk are working on their stuff, that they bring in some of the contemporary folk and vice versa. So,
but the sustainability story and the produce story is all very contemporary. And I think I don't want to speak for any colleagues involved in the distilleries, some of the more far-sighted distilleries have really got the message that their new products are actually linked to the historic brand, because that's what people expect. People expect a historic brand from Scotland, and they don't always get it.
Great, thank you.
Thanks very much. That's I thought that's a really interesting point. And Matt, I hope that we can collaborate. I would be really excited for Ellisland to collaborate and to draw on the expertise and the energy that you have brought to the Stove Network. And of course, I feel I should make a shout out here for our Kickstart placement at Ellisland, Ellis of Ellisland, Ellis Corrigan, who's a local girl who's a Duncan of Jordanson graduate, and who's hosting or facilitating this Zoom meeting, is actually an animator and has produced a lot of really interesting animations and graphics for Ellisland and has contemporized our image, and we really appreciate that, and we hope to do more of that in the future. I think we're kind of just about winding up. I don't know if anyone else wants to ask any questions. Now is your moment. One other thing that I wanted to say on the back of Matt's comments is, of course, Dumfries is the home of the Big Burns Supper. We're going to be collaborating with a part of the Big Burns Supper, hopefully, in terms of workshopping some theatre at Ellisland. But the Big Burns Supper is part of Scotland's Winter Events Festival, and I've certainly supported it for a long time. And I know that Graham Main, who's the director of the Big Burns Supper, talks about the inspiration of Burns. So not everything at the Big Burns Suppers Festival is about Burns, but it's about the spirit of Burns. And I know that the Big Burns Supper are also now developing more specific Burns themes as well, contemporary specific Burns themes. That I think that reflects some of the work that Murray's done in foregrounding Burns. So we're really fortunate to have that here in Dumfries and Galloway. I think we probably will wind up. I see that lots of people are giving their thanks, and I think I'll probably just wind up with my own vote of thanks, particularly to Murray, who is a very, very busy man, one of the busiest men I know, who has given his time for free tonight, and any money that we make from this event goes to Ellisland. So we're really grateful to that. I've already mentioned Ellis Corrigan, who's facilitating the meeting from a technical point of view, and this is the first time that she's done that through Zoom on her own, and I think she's done a great job. So thank you very much, Ellis, and also to Mary, Mary Hastings, who has been shadowing her and who is our newest member of staff. Hi, Mary. We feel this is 3 people employed at Ellisland. For a while we had nobody employed. So thanks to Museum Gallery Scotland for the project that Mary's involved in. So and Mary will be facilitating these meetings in future. So thank you very much for that. Thank you all for attending. And can I just flag up that our next online event, and you can see this through our website, is by Dr. David Hopes, and it's on the Treasures of Ellesland, which focuses on our collection, including our Mauchline ware. And that's on the 7th of April at 7 p.m. And if you're a member, you can access it with the code for free. And if not, it's only £3 plus booking fee. So we hope to see you there. So thank you all very much again. And good night.
Thank you very much, Jo.